first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here virtually. And as many of you know, I'm still in Macedonia. It's been the weirdest sabbatical ever, but these are the kinds of things that keep me grounded and connected to the Quebec community. It's also 6 hours ahead for me, so it's 8 p.m. And the kids are not off to bed yet, so you might see them coming in. They have permission to interrupt. But until they arrive, I will start with a presentation that's called NeuroLibre, Communicating Science Openly. And part of this presentation is going to be live. We're also going to have a brief recording because we felt like we should be very efficient with our time. And finally, my student Agah Karakuzu will give us a hands-on tutorial. And that's the part that I'm most excited by because it's very fresh. We have some cool developments, and hopefully people on this call will actually be able to get a taste of NeuroLibre and why we believe it's the future of academic publishing. So now that I've really kind of set this up, let me tell you about my experiences with academic publishing. In particular, I want to tell you about my research path. I did my undergrad, master's, and PhD at Stanford University in this lab, the Magnetic Resonance Systems Research Laboratory. So most of my research is in magnetic resonance, but recently I've been more and more active on academic publishing. But the reason I'm so passionate about this is because I come from a lab and from a culture where we were never under any pressure to publish. As a matter of fact, the head of this lab, the person who founded it, his name is Al Makovsky, there's even like a magazine with his face on the cover, had this philosophy of finding good people, getting out of their way, and letting them stay there for a long, long time. So you will see John Pauly, my PhD supervisor, Dwight Nishimura, my co-supervisor. They were at Stanford for like 15 years before they even became professors. And a lot of the people here have taken their time, and as a result, I think they've done some pretty important work. And I know this is not an MRI talk, but I do want to show you one equation. And that's the most famous equation in MRI, which is that the signal-to-noise ratio in imaging, magnetic resonance imaging, is proportional to the square root of the time spent imaging. Which means that if you want to double your signal in comparison to your noise, you should be working 4 times longer to achieve that effect. And this is a metaphor for something. But it's not just a metaphor. I think it's really a way that I have been practicing my science, and hopefully it shows in the work that I have done. And I just want to show you my research timeline because I think it illustrates what I'm really fighting for now that I have a professor position and I have some job security. So during my PhD, that took a while, I never published an academic paper. Not because there wasn't material. I had a lot of abstracts in conferences. But whenever I would ask my supervisor, so should we write this up as a publication, he would say, well, you should calculate the opportunity cost of doing that. Which means the time you spend writing a paper is really time spent not doing research. And sometimes waiting a little bit longer can pay off. So my first research article was actually published in 2011, which is almost a year and a half after I got my PhD. And a lot of the stuff in this paper is not actually part of my thesis. It kind of happened in that 1 year between I graduated and the year I started my postdoc, where I had some free time to think. And it's an idea that has been pretty popular since to combine diffusion imaging with myelin imaging. But basically, this was just kind of like a pre-registration for a study that I wanted to do, where I would combine myelin imaging with diffusion to get some information about the microstructural properties of white matter. So this is 2011. 4 years later, I actually conduct this experiment. And the name of this article was In Vivo Histology of the Myelin G Ratio with Magnetic Resonance Imaging. This was in 2015. Together with this paper, we actually published the code and the data. And finally, a couple of years later, 2018, I mean, we submitted in 2017, got published a year later. We kind of wrapped this up with a story called Promise and Pitfalls of G Ratio Estimation with MRI. These are the articles that got me my job and that, gave me freedom to do other things later. But if you ask me, even 4 is too many. I would say this should just be 1 article. Here is the pre-registration. This is what we want to do. Here's the actual description of the experiment together with the data. And we also published a software article to go with it. And then here's the story. Now that we've done all this, let's see how promising this technique is, and also what are the challenges that we face in doing it. And I think that's, the illustration of what I will talk about for the rest of today, which is how we can increase the signal-to-noise ratio, but hopefully publishing less, but publishing more quality content. I have been very involved with science communication, and part of it is pretty standard, I would say mainstream. I was on the board of this journal, Magnetic Resonance in Medicine. We had this virtual issue that we co-edited with Christine, who's on the call right now, about biophysical MR modeling of the central nervous system. I was a guest editor for a special issue for NeuroImage, where we collected a lot of papers related to microstructural imaging. But then on the more, popular popular part of science communication, I also founded this blog that was the blog of the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. We also founded the blog of the International Society for Magnetic Resonance in Medicine. In particular, the biggest flagship product of this blog was Magnetic Resonance in Medicine Highlights. This is still going under the leadership of Mathieu Boudreau in my lab, where we interview people in the field and try to learn more about their histories and their personalities. I started a network of MR researchers in the Balkan called mrbalkan.org. This is how I met my first 2 PhD students, so it really paid off. One of them is on the call. The other one is defending his PhD tomorrow. So I think he's very busy preparing his slides. But Agah is on the call, and he will join us a bit later with his presentation. Met him in Turkey in 2014, Agah, I believe?
13. But yeah.
13, all right, there you go. And then this is the grant and the initiative that I would like to tell you most about, because it's the most recent, most exciting for me. It's called the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform. And just wait and see. You'll see that we do quite a lot of things, a lot of it with support of the QBIN, for which we're very grateful. So now a little bit of history. Scientific publishing. It's as old as the printing press. It's been around for centuries. It actually has preceded journals or newspapers. So this is the first academic journal. It's the Proceedings of the Royal Society. And these are collected letters from 1665 and 1666, because that's the way that science used to be communicated. People would actually sit in a room and they would read each other letters about the research they did. And eventually they found a way to print it. And they found a way to print it even before the London Gazette, which is the first newspaper in the world, which came out in 1666. So scientific publishing precedes newspapers. Now, a brief overview, thanks to Agah, of how this academic publishing has evolved through the ages. So first journal, 1666, 1731, first peer-reviewed journal. And peer review is a contentious topic because what they thought of peer review in 1731 is very different from the peer review that we have today. But they started reviewing each other's work in, a very formalized standard way. But back in 1731, there were less than 1,000 scientists in the world. And the visualizations were really beautiful, but simple. Like here is a visualization from an article in 1741 explaining how to straighten a tree. And, you tie it to a stick, and that's one way to remedy its shape. Things have progressed since. 19th century saw a lot of inventions, first carbon paper, first light bulb, first typewriter, and then it became a little bit easier to produce papers. So then we get to the 1900s, where we have about 10,000 academic journals, and we have about 100,000 scientists. So 2 orders of magnitude. And the visualizations get a little bit more sophisticated. So this is the visualization from the famous ECG article by Eindhoven, published in The Lancet. And you will see that, this has a little bit more sophistication than this graph. But also we have modern equipment to actually be writing our papers. And then the world keeps going forward, speeding up. We have Xerox copier, LaTeX, Microsoft Word. All of a sudden, text editing is really, really simple. And in the 90s, we get the World Wide Web. And now we're working with 1 million scientists. And things are getting kind of busy, things are speeding up. And at this time in the 90s, everybody thought, academic publishers, they really have to change their game. Something's got to give. You cannot just keep cranking out these papers. But we were wrong. Everybody was guessing that the World Wide Web will be the end of conventional publishing. Never happened. As a matter of fact, we're still kind of stuck in the same 17th century paradigm. Even though in 1990, Archive was formed. That was the first preprint server. And preprints are important. I hope that many of you are using them. But they're a way of uploading a research article before it gets peer-reviewed, which also means it's easy for people to spot errors, spread the word, and that could be a plus or a minus depending on how you look at it, but has definitely changed the way that we write our work. PDFs, they were developed again in the 90s. Google came about 98, actually organized all of this knowledge. And then we get to the 21st century. And this is where we have more than 8 million scientists, and we have a lot of data and a lot of code. Science has gotten very computationally intensive. And just to illustrate this point, Amazon Web Services, GitHub, Project Jupyter, which you'll hear a lot about today, all of these are really the product of the last 20 years. And a product of the last year, the moment COVID hit, that was just a flurry of papers. This is actually in March 2020, so pretty much as the pandemic was being announced, and there were already 1,560 papers, and this number has only exploded from there. And a lot of them are just preprints. Some of them are peer-reviewed, but hopefully I don't need to convince you that, it's just a lot of noise. Some of it is good, but how do you actually make sense of it when it's just like drinking from a fire hose? And the argument I will make today is that we need to go beyond the PDF. Sure, it's a great format, but we've been stuck with PDFs for hundreds of years, and something's got to change. And hopefully by the end of this talk today, you will agree with me. Biggest problem that we have at the moment, all of these articles, very few of them are actually available openly to read. And even when they are, the taxpayers still pay for this ecosystem to actually crank out article after article, journal after journal. And these are just some stats that hopefully will shock you. This is the operating profits of scientific, technical, and medical division of Reed Elsevier. Reed Elsevier is the biggest academic publisher. And this is from Vincent Larivière, who's actually at the University of Montreal. He's a researcher, a librarian, who is very vocal about what needs to change in the current publishing climate. And I hope some of you get a chance to meet him because he's really exciting person, and also somebody who deeply believes that the system is flawed. Because the operating profits have increased from about $300 million for Reed Elsevier in the 90s, all the way to over $1 billion in 2015. And the numbers are only more depressing from there. Their profit margins have also increased. We're talking profit margins on the order of 40%, which is bigger than banks, bigger than Google. They're really in a league of their own. So just to compare, here's Elsevier's profit margin, and here are the profit margins of the Bank of America and Toyota. And you will see that, these per dollar make way more money. You would say, well, maybe just, inflation is going up, but that's not the case. If you take a look at the consumer price index, here it is in dotted green. And then if you take a look at the expenditures for publications, for journals, that has been going up way, way faster. So, we have inflation, and it's an inflation of papers, but we also have inflation of expenses that libraries have to pay to access articles. And this is, I would argue, not sustainable in the near future. Not the only one. This is The Guardian with an article called, "Is the Staggeringly Profitable Business of Scientific Publishing Bad for Science?" It's a loaded question, so I won't answer it, but you can read the article and I think you can make up your mind. But what's really interesting is that we have a crisis. And the crisis is we have just way too many articles. If you take the first article of the first page of every article ever published, and you just stack them on top of each other, this mountain of papers, just the very first page of every article, would reach a mountain that in 2015 was as high as Mount Kilimanjaro. By now, it's higher than Mount Everest. And out of this mountain of articles, all of them PDFs, all of them paper, about half of them don't get a single citation. And then another third or so get between 1 and 9 citations. And then another fifth or so get between 10 and 99 citations. And it's only here near the top where you actually get the influential articles. Doesn't mean they're the good articles. It only means that those are the ones that actually manage to rise to the top. And one can only imagine how much good work there is in these 2/3 approximately that very few people have read or cited. And when I say read, I actually mean it. Whether you want to admit it or not, you don't read many papers. And I have the stats to show it. These are the number of publications and how they've been going up. Number of clinical trials has also been going up from the 70s all the way to the 2020s. This is supposedly how many papers faculty read from 1977 to 271. Supposedly, in 2006, we were reading twice as many articles as we were in 1977. But on top of it, the productivity of these papers wasn't really going up. If you count years of life saved per 100,000 people, per 100 publications, actually, it's a U-shaped curve. Seems like we were doing well in the 80s, but now we're kind of in a region of diminishing returns. And this is part of what is actually called the Great Stagnation. Some people are arguing that scientific progress is slowing down, and they're often using this graph for illustration. And then on top of it, supposedly we're reading more, but the readability of papers is going down. So there was an article published in eLife that showed how, because of jargon, because of specialization, the readability of papers in the early 1900s was way, way higher compared to recent times. And yeah, papers are getting longer, papers are getting more jargony. And if you take a look at how many downloads papers have, it's not a lot. And then out of those downloads, how many actually just read the abstract? Yeah, quite a few. And now we end up with these long papers, 10 pages, PDFs, 10 figures. But in reality, we skim the figures, we go through some of the text, but we're too busy. We have to write our own work. So papers don't get the attention they could be getting. All this has also been accompanied by big overcomplication of the figures that we show. Here is Nikola Stikov figure. This is 1741. Makes sense. You don't need to understand much about it. And then 279 years, here's a typical figure in nature. It's still printed on paper. It's a digital picture. But does this really help you understand much? There's so many panels, and not to pick on this one, it's very representative, but it's really, really difficult to unpack this. And just keep in mind how much code and how much data goes behind this figure. But then in the end, here we are, we just printed it and we showed it to you, and you're supposed to make sense of it and cite it in the future and hopefully, you know, get more visibility that way. So we've lost some elegance in the process. So I think what's happened is what we've got here is a failure to communicate. This is a quote from one of my favorite movies. It's Cool Hand Luke. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Paul Newman is amazing in it. Well, the solution, some would argue, is in open science. Let's make it a little bit easier to access our science. Well, that could mean open access publishing, make it free to read, which is great. But then make the data sets also open. Have us be able to access the data, and on top of it, the code that's actually used to analyze the data. And then we can go to some more extreme proposals, such as maybe the peer review needs to be open. Because currently, we go with a single blind or a double blind process. Very rarely do we know who's reviewing our work, but that's not the biggest problem. The problem is that the reviews themselves are hidden. So I like to read comments on YouTube, I like to read comments on Facebook, but I can't read comments on papers because they're private. And recently there's been some push to actually make at least the content of the review open, but it's not going easy because we do work that's unpaid. And when we actually review a paper, often we're conflicted about it. We have some kind of interest about it, and yet we don't want the world to see what we actually wrote. And again, I'm overgeneralizing, but think about it. When you agree to review a paper, it's probably because you have an interest in the topic. So, you know, there is some kind of conflicts that are present, and sometimes not acknowledged. Some people would go as far as to say that the scientific paper is obsolete. I don't believe that, but again, it's a fascinating read if you want to read this popular article. And the argument this article is making is that, well, the paper, burn it. There's actually other things that we could be using to communicate our science. One of the proposals is to use this novel format called Jupyter, Project Jupyter, Jupyter Notebooks and Jupyter Books. And you'll hear way more about them in a little bit. But this is just a quote from Fernando Perez, who is the founder, the creator of Project Jupyter. And he's also a professor at Berkeley. And he's also somebody who's very aware that we as scientists are losing our best people to industry. And here's the quote verbatim. At this point, nobody in their sane mind challenges the fact that the praxis of scientific research is under major upheaval. Perez, the creator of Jupyter, wrote in a blog post in 2013. As science becomes more about computation, the skills required to be a good scientist become increasingly attractive in industry. Universities lose their best people to startups, to Google and Microsoft. I have seen many talented colleagues leave academia in frustration over the last decade, he wrote, and I can't think of a single one who wasn't happier years later. So that's the situation in which we are. We're doing work that's very similar to the work that industry is doing, but we're stuck in some old ways of communicating our science, and we lose the computationally literate people to industry. And we need to make our way of practicing science a little bit more appealing. This is where Jupyter Notebooks come in. They're just one possibility, but we're excited by the potential. And I believe that quite a few of you have used them in the past. We use them in courses. More and more, we use them in creating educational materials and even research articles. The beautiful thing about them, they run in a web browser. So, it's really easy to just open up a port, deploy a notebook. You can take a look at text, comments, equations, just like in a regular article. But then you can take a look at lines of code. You can take a look at the outputs, the values, the images, the plots. And you can be modifying these in real time to observe how different modifications affect your findings. So this is something that was published in 1995 by Buckheit and Donahoe, arguing that an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It is merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions which generated the figures. And inspired by this, we made this graph where the published article is just the tip of the iceberg. And then below the surface, we have everything else. The data, the software, the unpublished results, the discussions, the notebooks, the protocols. And unfortunately, researchers don't get credit for whatever is below the surface. And we're trying to change that. And in particular, we wrote a blog post for PLOS. That's one of the biggest open access publishers, Public Library of Science. It was called the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform, catching up to Plan S and going further. Plan S is the European plan to make all research funded by European funds to be published open access. We want to go beyond and actually publish the data and publish the code. And fortunately, this blog post actually opened quite a few doors for us, and you'll get to hear about that in just a little bit. So here's a recipe for reproducibility. This was made, I believe, a couple of years ago by Agah. I still use it because I think it illustrates the 4 steps that I think are really important. Make your code available on GitHub. Make the data publicly available somewhere. Containerize your environment so that you can actually deploy it and be independent of the architecture, infrastructure on which it's running. And finally, make the plots and the visualizations interactive so that it's easier to explore them and to understand what the paper is about. And this is what we try to accomplish with the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform. The PI is Alan Evans. Many of you know him. It's a pan-Canadian $11 million grant. It has about 35 partners, most of them academic, all throughout Canada. And we are already in our 4th year of operation, and we're hoping for renewal next year. So hopefully the project will keep going. And it's a very ambitious project. There's lots of aspects of ethics and governance and data sharing and data curation that are beyond the scope of this talk, because today the talk is about NeuroLibre. NeuroLibre is a repository of interactive neuroscience notebooks that seamlessly integrates data, text, code, and figures. It is deployed using cloud computing infrastructure, and it goes beyond the PDF. So basically, rather than have static documents that I've been arguing against for the past 15 minutes, we want to breathe new life into academic publishing by incorporating text, data, code, and interactive figures. And because we don't have too much time, I will actually play a recording made by Agah Karakuzu that tries to kind of condense everything we've been doing with NeuroLibre over the past couple of years. And then when that recording stops, Agah will actually return in real time, and he will try to teach you about how to make a NeuroLibre publication and hopefully get you excited to be beta testers for our platform. So I just want to thank the people who are working on NeuroLibre. In particular, Pierre Belek, myself, and Samir Das are three people who were with CONP from the very beginning. We were fortunate to be joined by Jean-Baptiste Pauline and lots of PhD students and researchers. Agah Karakuzu and Elizabeth Dupré have been instrumental in bringing us to this point in time. And we hope that pretty soon there will be an article about NeuroLibre, but hopefully not a PDF. Hopefully we can do something a little bit more exciting than that. So let me just play you a video, and then we'll come back in real time with Agah, who's on the call. And let me just make sure that I'm sharing audio, because sometimes I forget to do that. So I'll just do another share. Share sound and optimize for video clip. And there we are.
We planted seeds of NeuroLibre in open fields, such as eLife and plus computational biology, and even in some other fields surrounded by proprietary fences such as MRM by Wiley or even Elsevier. But in the end, they all grew up nicely and became accessible to everyone. In this open atmosphere, we envision NeuroLibre as an organic partner of OHBM Aperture and looking forward to it coming alive soon. So now, starting with eLife, I will give you examples of how NeuroLibre can invigorate academic publishing. For quite a long time, the microstructural imaging community wanted to have a sense of which MRI measure is the most suitable to quantify myelin. And recently we tried addressing this question with a meta-analysis, which is now published in eLife. Studies included in this meta-analysis differed from each other in various aspects, such as quantified measure, reference methods, or subject type. As you would expect, this non-uniformity doesn't make a qualitative synthesis of the existing literature any better, especially if the data is presented by spreadsheets in several landscape pages presented in a row. But what if there was a better way to distill that information into digestible content, such as an interactive tree map published in NeuroLibre? This figure not only shows how effect size is distributed concerning different grouping conditions, but it is a gateway to every single one of those articles. Then we went ahead and made all the figures in this analysis interactive and created a NeuroLibre book that can integrate our code and the data. Now, when you visit this article on eLife, you will see a link to the NeuroLibre book right in the abstract. As it can bring life to publications, NeuroLibre makes a great tool for interactive tutorials too. A while ago, we were looking for ways to publish a series of interactive tutorials for T1 mapping in QMR Labs blog. After NeuroLibre was born, we converted these multiple interactive blog posts into a single NeuroLibre book. And to do that, the Jupyter book format was really helpful because it gave us an easy way to create a collection of different methods in a well-organized document. Then later on, this NeuroLibre T1 mapping book turned into a book chapter published by Elsevier in the first volume of Quantitative Magnetic Resonance Imaging. And the book itself is, of course, behind the paywall, but it is agreed that the NeuroLibre will be published under the Creative Commons license, and there will be a hyperlink to it in the book chapter. So this way, NeuroLibre was able to go beyond just bringing interactivity to an online code execution to the content, but it naturally moved a significant portion of the end product beyond the proprietary fence and made it available to everyone. And recently, many fields are getting warmed up to the idea of publishing content beyond PDFs. This editorial published in MRM shows that MRI research is one of those fields, and it recognizes NeuroLibre as a platform that can make it happen. So with a small notebook factory team, we are working on converting highlighted MRM publications into NeuroLibre format. We've done a few articles, and we are still working to create more of these. Matthew Bodrow is a NeuroLibre team member. He's working on publishing an editorial in PLOS Computational Biology. And for this editorial, he analyzed the open source landscape of the articles published in this journal. And this analysis revealed that about 40% of the articles matching these keywords of GitHub, open source, shared, and such, they all shared some code, where 75% of them were hosted on GitHub, and about half of them were written in Python. Matthew also analyzed these repositories to find out that about 70% of the shared content was in Jupyter Notebooks, and about 12% of all the shared content reproduced their figures. So we can see that PLOS Computational Biology is a decent venue for NeuroLibre. But we didn't stop there by reporting some numbers. To show the extent of what is possible, we helped create NeuroLibre books for 2 PLOS articles, and they were very well received by the authors. Actually, in one of these papers, we went above and beyond the scope of the article and created interactive figures showing how results would be different if the analysis were run with different parameter configurations. I guess many of us know the story of the Little Prince. He is afraid that some greedy sprouts are going to turn up and take over his little planet. And he works hard every single day to weed them out because he knew if he acted too late, it would be a catastrophe. But he knew that there were good seeds of good plants as well. They would even turn into beautiful flowers he would fall in love with in the future. And maybe that's also why he kept the landscape open. And like the Little Prince, we are putting our best effort to create an ideal environment where good seeds can turn into sprouts of living publications. Because we know that these sprouts will be miraculous when they are fully grown to become NeuroLibre publications. Obviously, NeuroLibre is off to a great start thanks to our amazing sponsors, the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform, Brain Canada Foundation, Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives, and Quebec Bioimaging Network. We would like to thank Cancer Computing for their generous donation of computational resources and all the contributors from Origami Lab, Neuropoly, and CIMEXP. And finally, thank you so much for listening to.
All right. So that was the first half hour of the presentation. Hopefully this idea of preprints that I mentioned at the very beginning now kind of makes sense when we talk about NeuroLibre. What we want to accomplish with NeuroLibre is make it a preprint server for interactive research objects, so that no matter whether you want to have it as a standalone or a supplement to a publication, you have a place to submit it so that journals can actually review it. And this is what we managed to accomplish with the eLife article, which to us was a great success. Now we actually have a high impact publication that benefited from the NeuroLibre treatment, but also these examples in MRM, in PLOS Computational Biology, and in Elsevier in a book. We actually had an interactive book chapter as a preprint, show the way forward. And I would like to acknowledge a couple of people that are also on the call here. We actually have a small team in Macedonia. My sabbatical has been a good way to engage with them and have them work on a couple of more NeuroLibre publications, which we hope to announce sometime in May during the International Society for Magnetic Resonance in Medicine meeting. So things are moving forward and things are moving fast, but at some point we will need your help. And the help is getting you to submit, but also learning what the process is and how you can actually help us improve NeuroLibre. And for that goal, Agah Karakuzu made a small interactive tutorial. Hopefully we get some feedback from you, and then we'll stick around and answer any questions you might have. So Agah, are you ready?
Yeah, I am. It's actually going to be real time rather than interactive. So hope that things are going to go smoothly.
Agah is one of the few people who dares to do a live demo, and
Yeah.
I'm always in awe. So no pressure, Agah.
Hope for the best. Yeah. So I think Nikola made it really clear that we need to go beyond PDF, but how do we go beyond PDF and create publishable and citable objects, right? So it's doesn't come to our mind that easily, because when we think about a traditional preprint, I think we all have a workflow in our minds. We start with a PowerPoint presentation that has 5 to 6 figures in it, right? Then we write captions for them and then go ahead and create a Word document, start with results. And then suddenly we have 10, 12 versions of that Word document floating around with the co-authors, and it grows so easily. But when we think about a modern publication object, such as NeuroLibre, of course, we can envision entry points to this as a GitHub repository. So in that case, it not only solves the problem of version controlling, such as the final underscore version 12 problem, but also it can supercharge what we can publish. And I think you can see my screen right now, right? It's the Visual Studio Code. Okay, great. So this is the bare bones GitHub repository organization for a NeuroLibre submission. As you can see, you have gitignore, license, readme. They are must-haves of any GitHub repository. But here we see a paper.markdown and a tiny bibliography. So PDFs are not bad. They are good. But in this case, we are using them as a sidecar object just to give a really, really brief summary about what this preprint is going to be about. We can think it like a letter to the editor, or like just a really, really brief description of why this preprint is really important. It's a tiny communication document. So we like to keep this short, brief, because the actual content is going to be a Jupyter book. But another important role of this document is going to be containing some metadata about the publication. So as you can see here, we define the title of our preprint and we define some tags. And here we put the list of authors in here with their name, ORCID ID, and their affiliations. We put a date and also associate a bit text formatted bibliography with this markdown file, which is simply just a few articles or proceedings, whatnot, the simple format that you can export from many citation managers. And then here in the summary section, you can have whatever a typical LaTeX environment provides you with in pure markdown format with some, with some small LaTeX flavor in here. You can put your citations, you can add your figures and everything. And that's it on the paper front. But we also need to create a description for our execution runtime environment and also for our data requirements. And to do that, we have this binder folder in here. So when we look into that, we have a data requirements.json. So here, this repository is intended for a NeuroLearn tutorial. So it downloads the data from the NeuroLearn library. So we define a tiny source code in here, define the project name. And then once we deploy this to NeuroLibre, it is going to cache that data for this submission. So whenever it is accessed, it is not going to re-download the data. The data will be already available for users to interact with. So it's cool that now we have a solution for the data, but we also need a solution for the requirements. In this case, this is a pure Python project. So it's just a few matplotlib and NeuroLearn dependencies. That starting is not important at this point. And here we are, the content of a Jupyter book. this is how it looks like. You put some markdown files or Jupyter books. You can also put another references here to be used inside of these Jupyter book objects. So this is independent from the PDF. So we have some important configuration files in here. One of them is config.yaml. So here it again defines title. You can put the author lists, but this is not that much important because we are going to grab that author information from the paper.md. But we also define some execution settings. So here there are many configuration settings that are provided by Jupyter Book. I'm not going to go through all of them one by one, but there are some really cool features that you can enable by changing some configurations here, such as hypothesis, which enables collaborative annotation. But you can also here define the code repository and where our content is going to be within the repo, which points to this folder. So yeah, I won't go into the details too much. Another important document that we require to come up with a successful Jupyter Book build is the _talk table of contents.yaml. And here we provide some files, which is agnostic to the file format. So it looks for 0-1 data structures. It can be a markdown file or it can be a Jupyter notebook. So in this case, this is a markedly structured markdown file, but I'll show you another example with Jupyter notebooks because I think we are more familiar with that one in this repository. So yeah, this is another NeuroLibre submission. This is actually the one that we submitted for the eLife publication that Nikola just showed in our presentation. And as you can see here, we have slightly a bit different execution runtime dependency. Here we have Python, but on top of that we have R. And obviously we need to define a different runtime depending on the Python version. And content here is a bit more involved. We just don't have two sections, but now we have kind of chapters. We have 4 chapters organized in folders, and each of them containing a Jupyter notebook with their outputs already saved and rendered. So this is one important point. And also in the configuration file and table of content, when you look at the table of content of this one, this is how it goes. It's file, part, and chapters, and you define the contents for that one. And of course, there is an a really brief markdown file for the introduction. So cool, we have everything we need. Obviously, we have text, we have data, we have execution runtime dependencies, but how do we create the notebook? So as we have PowerPoint and Microsoft Word installed to our local computers, we also need to have these things installed to our computers to be able to work with that. So here I have all those dependencies installed locally on a Conda environment. And now for this content, I'm going to build a Jupyter book, which is placed in the content folder. And to do that, I'll do a Jupyter book build, and then I'm going to point to the content folder. So there's one important thing here that I'd like to note. So in this case, all the outputs in my Jupyter notebooks are already saved and rendered. So if you clear your outputs and restart it, and then your configuration file turns off the re-execution of the notebooks, your outputs are not going to be rendered in the Jupyter book. So that's one critical detail that I'll come to later when I'm talking about our preview service. So now I'm going to go ahead and start the Jupyter book build. As it was already built, it cached and it happened really fast, but I'm going to just show you what we are going to be looking at. So it's rendered as a static web page. You can just copy paste this. Can you see my web browser, by the way? Okay, cool. And here we are. We have a Jupyter book that contains all the notebooks that we saw in those separate folders. And you can hide and show some of the code blocks. I'm going to show you how to do that. We have this nice directives within colored boxes for warnings, notes. And as you can see, our interactive figures are already accessible here. And yeah, it goes for all the Jupyter books that were in the directory. And this is determined by the table of contents file, table of contents.yaml. Going back to the Jupyter notebooks, I should show some Jupyter notebooks and how to edit, for example, the metadata to achieve that. So I'm going to the content folder, and this is where the builds are stored, by the way. There's going to be a build folder created once you execute your notebooks and build a notebook. And then here, the second one, this is going to throw me something weird, but that's fine. Here, if you go to View and Cell toolbar, you will see this Edit Metadata toggle. And using that Edit Metadata, you can define whether you like to hide an input or show it. So if you hide an input, then it is going to, the cell is going to render like this. But if you don't, the cell blocks will be already visible once you open your document. But another cool thing about this Jupyter book is that, as you can see here, we have a binder session, collab session, or a live code. We can interact inline. So we can re-execute all the cells in this book right away. So this is pretty much how we create a Jupyter book. But of course, we also should be able to create these things and publish on the NeuroLibre site. And to see that if it's possible, we created a preview service for that one. This is right now hosted on robonero.herokuapp.com. And it asks you to provide a repository address. So now I'm going to put my repository address for the repo that I showed you, which is github.com/Agah First, I am going to go ahead and render the PDF, rem that paper.bib and paper.markdown, that high-level summary. In this case, this is a placeholder PDF, but let's go ahead and compile it and hope that it's going to work. So yeah, right now it's just rendering a PDF. Yes, it finished. That's great. So now we click here to see our results. And yeah, this is the PDF version of the markdown that we wrote. And once the review is completed, it's going to have the names of the reviewers or all other details that is associated with that GitHub repository, be it the archive version, also GitHub repo, and a DOI. So of course, this is not the cool thing about it. The better thing is that we can also now preview a Jupyter book build. So I already built this one. And a disclaimer, this is a work in progress. This page, this is not a beta version yet. This is not highly stable, but it is working right now to some level. So right now I just put my repository. It met all the dependencies that I need to be able to create a Jupyter book, the folder organization, minimum requirements. So now when I click here, it is going to take me to the Jupyter book that is built on our test server and served from that channel. And this is, as you can see, the same content with what I was showing locally. So that's pretty much it. So for on the test, and if we can create a Jupyter book locally with our dependencies defined properly and our code and everything, We hope that our preview service is going to be able to mimic that and also generate the content and share it with you. So once you are happy with your Jupyter book build, then you are going to be ready for making your actual submission on the NeuroLibre page, which is right now on the neurolibre.herocup.com, but we are going to migrate them to their own domains. There are one or two details I'd like to share you about how you can use this online service, because we have some requirements and some limitations. But this is going to be the face of our NeuroLibre web page. Here you can find some documentation about how to submit your papers. And when you click Submit a Preprint to NeuroLibre, it is going to ask you to log in with your ORCID authorization, and then it will guide you through the submission steps. So we are still all working on to complete some bits and pieces of this pipeline, but eventually, once it is published, it is going to become a card on the repo where people can click on, and it's going to take them to the Jupyter book. And it also it's going to have a DOI, a companion PDF, and everything. Yeah, one small detail on the GitHub repository end: to keep this number of requests to our test server at a decent level, we had some filtering. So if you go and check my commit history, I passed this argument called --build book. Only then the NeuroLibre server will allow you to actually consume those resources to build a Jupyter book. Another detail, we right now assume that you saved all your outputs, so that when we build the book, we are not going to re-execute them. But if we need to do that, right now we are limited to an execution environment that is defined by requirements.txt only, and by 30 minutes of build time. Yeah, so there are two repositories that I prepared for showcasing this, and the second one was Agah Karakuzu _ NeuroLibre template. Some of them are going to become, I guess, a template repository on the NeuroLibre GitHub organization, so that you can take them, create any repo from them. It also gives you a great head start to begin with the submission process. So yeah, I think this is pretty much it. I should stop sharing.
Great. Thank you very much, Agah. So we made it under an hour, and hopefully you got to see the vision, and you also got to see some nitty-gritty. But most importantly, now we want to hear from you. If anybody wants to help us out, please let us know. But also, if you have questions about what we're doing, this is a good time to ask and discuss.
And again, I just like to say that submission page, the preview service, is going to improve. But right now, if you do something, it's much likely to break things. But we will solve all those issues in about a week or so.